Inside ADX Florence, where the worst criminals are buried alive. The most secure prison in America. In the high desert of southern Colorado, about 100 miles south of Denver, sits the most secure prison in the United States. Its official name is the United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility. Most people know it simply as ADX Florence. Opened in 1994, ADX Florence was designed for one purpose: to hold inmates considered the most dangerous, the most violent, or the most escape-prone in the federal prison system. Here, prisoners live in near-total isolation. They spend approximately 22 to 24 hours a day alone in single cells. Human contact is minimal. Communication is restricted. Movement is tightly controlled. For many inmates, this is the final stop in the American prison system. It has been called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Others have used a more haunting phrase, a clean version of hell. This is not metaphor. It is how some former inmates and attorneys have described it in court filings. Tonight, on Beyond the Bars, we step inside ADX Florence, a place built not just to contain bodies, but to control every movement, every sound, every second. And before we go further, if you value deeply researched, fully factual prison documentaries like this, take a moment to like and subscribe to Beyond the Bars. Your support helps us continue producing accurate, long-form stories that go beyond headlines and into the truth. Now, we begin. Why ADX was built. ADX Florence was not built in isolation from history. It was built because of it. In the 1980s, violence inside several high-security federal prisons reached alarming levels. At the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, 2 correctional officers were killed in separate incidents in 1983. In response, the prison went into permanent lockdown. Marion effectively became a prototype for what would later evolve into a Supermax model, a prison within a prison, where inmates were confined alone for nearly 23 hours per day. The Federal Bureau of Prisons concluded that certain inmates posed such extreme security threats that traditional maximum security prisons were not sufficient. These inmates included leaders of violent prison gangs, terrorism convicts, inmates who had killed other prisoners, inmates who had assaulted or murdered correctional staff, escape risks. By the late 1980s, the Bureau of Prisons approved plans to construct a new facility specifically designed for permanent, high-level control. Construction began in Florence, Colorado, near an existing federal prison complex. The new facility would be called Administrative Maximum, ADX. It officially opened in 1994. Its purpose was explicit: absolute control. Location: the Florence Prison Complex. ADX Florence is not a standalone building. It is part of the larger federal correctional complex, Florence, often called the Florence Supermax Complex. The complex includes a minimum security camp, a medium security facility, a high-security United States Penitentiary, and ADX, the Administrative Maximum Facility. The location was strategic. Florence, Colorado, is rural and geographically isolated. The surrounding terrain is open, dry, and highly visible, ideal for security. Escape would be extraordinarily difficult. The facility itself is surrounded by multiple layers of fencing, razor wire, motion sensors, surveillance cameras, guard towers. The perimeter is reinforced with armed patrols. The architecture was engineered to minimize blind spots and eliminate opportunities for coordinated inmate movement. Security here is layered, physical, technological, and procedural. Inside a Supermax cell, an ADX cell measures approximately 7 feet by 12 feet. Everything inside is constructed from poured concrete. The bed is a concrete slab. The desk is a concrete shelf. The stool is molded concrete. There are no bars. Instead, there is a solid steel door with a narrow vertical window. Meals are passed through a slot. The window to the outside is narrow and angled upward, designed so the inmate cannot see the horizon, only the sky. This design was intentional. According to the Bureau of Prisons, the architecture reduces external stimulation and prevents inmates from mapping the facility's layout. Inmates eat alone. They exercise alone, typically in a small enclosed area sometimes described as a recreation pen or dog run. Most inmates remain confined for 22 to 23 hours per day. Television access, when granted, is controlled and limited to approved programming. Telephone privileges are restricted and monitored. Contact visits are not permitted in most cases. Visits, when allowed, occur through thick glass partitions. The isolation is systematic. Who is sent to ADX? Not every federal inmate can be sent to ADX. Placement is determined by the Bureau of Prisons through a classification and referral process. Inmates may be transferred to ADX for killing another inmate, killing or assaulting prison staff, Leading violent gang activity inside prison. Escape attempts. Serious disciplinary records. Terrorism-related convictions. The facility has housed international terrorism convicts, domestic extremists, organized crime leaders, high-ranking gang members, individuals convicted of major espionage. Among the most publicly known former inmates, Ramzi Youssef, convicted for masterminding the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Zacarias Moussaoui, the only person convicted in a U.S. court for involvement in the September 11 attacks. Jakar Tsarnaev, convicted for the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. Terry Nichols, accomplice in the Oklahoma City bombing. These placements are publicly documented in court records and Bureau of Prisons reports. However, the Bureau of Prisons does not publicly disclose the full roster of inmates for security reasons. Daily life under control. Life inside ADX follows strict routine. Lights turn on early. Meals are delivered through the slot in the door. Inmates eat alone. Showers occur in individual stalls. Exercise, when permitted, happens in isolated enclosures. Communication between inmates is deliberately restricted. Movement outside the cell requires full restraints, handcuffs, leg irons. Often additional security escort. Officers monitor activity continuously. Every procedure is logged. Every movement documented. According to Bureau of Prisons policy, ADX is designed to manage inmates who cannot be safely housed elsewhere. Officials maintain that the facility is necessary to protect staff, other inmates, and national security. But critics argue that prolonged isolation can have serious psychological consequences. That debate would eventually reach federal court. And it would force the Bureau of Prisons to answer difficult questions. That's where we go next. The psychological cost of isolation. When ADX Florence opened in 1994, it represented the most restrictive model of incarceration in the federal system. But almost immediately, questions emerged. What does prolonged isolation do to the human mind? Under ADX conditions, inmates may spend years, sometimes more than a decade, in near total separation from other prisoners. Human interaction is limited primarily to brief exchanges with correctional staff. Programming is restricted. Group activities are generally non-existent. According to court filings and psychiatric evaluations submitted in federal lawsuits, some inmates developed symptoms including anxiety, depression, hallucinations, paranoia, and self-harm behaviors. In 2012, a class action lawsuit was filed against the Federal Bureau of Prisons by several ADX inmates. The case alleged that prisoners with serious mental illness were being held in conditions that worsened their psychiatric conditions. The lawsuit, known as Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, argued that prolonged isolation violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The Bureau of Prisons did not admit wrongdoing. However, in 2016, the case was settled. As part of the settlement, the Bureau agreed to create reforms, including improved mental health screening, step-down programs for certain inmates, enhanced mental health treatment services, greater monitoring of inmates with diagnosed psychiatric conditions. The settlement did not close ADX. It did not end solitary confinement. But it acknowledged that changes were necessary. The step-down program. One of the key reforms at ADX was the expansion of what is known as the step-down program. Originally implemented in the early 2000s and later expanded, the step-down program allows inmates to gradually transition from the most restrictive units to less restrictive housing. The goal is behavioral modification. Inmates must demonstrate sustained compliance with institutional rules. Progression occurs in stages. These stages may include increased recreation time, limited group interaction in controlled settings, educational programming delivered through cell-based systems, gradual increase in communication privileges. Movement through the program can take years. Some inmates never complete it. The Bureau of Prisons states that the step-down program provides a pathway out of ADX for inmates who no longer pose extreme security threats. Critics argue that the standards for progression can be opaque and that decisions remain heavily discretionary. Precise data on how many inmates successfully transfer out of ADX each year is not consistently published in detail. However, the Bureau has confirmed that some inmates are transferred back to other federal facilities after completing the program. ADX is not always permanent. But for many, it lasts a very long time. Security by design. ADX Florence was engineered around a central philosophy: eliminate opportunity. The architecture itself enforces discipline. Doors are remotely operated. Movement is staggered to prevent inmate contact. Corridors are segmented to restrict line of sight. Even the recreation areas are individually enclosed to prevent communication. The perimeter security includes double fencing, razor wire, Electronic detection systems. Armed guard towers. The facility was designed in consultation with security experts following violent incidents in federal prisons during the 1980s. There have been no successful escapes from ADX Florence since it opened in 1994. That fact is frequently cited by Bureau of Prisons officials when defending the necessity of the Supermax model. The security record is clear. The debate lies elsewhere, in the human cost. Terrorism cases and national security. After the September 11 attacks, ADX Florence took on an expanded national security role. Several individuals convicted of terrorism-related offenses were transferred to the facility. These included Ramzi Youssef, Zacharias Moussaoui, Richard Reed, Jakar Sarnayev. The Bureau of Prisons does not publicly disclose the exact housing locations of terrorism inmates within ADX, citing security concerns. However, court records confirm that several high-profile terrorism convicts have been held there. The government has argued that ADX provides the highest level of control necessary to prevent communication with extremist networks or coordination with outside actors. Defense attorneys in some cases have challenged the conditions of confinement, particularly regarding restrictions on communication. In terrorism cases, special administrative measures, known as SAMs, may be imposed. SAMs can further restrict mail, phone calls, and attorney access beyond standard ADX conditions. These measures are authorized by the Attorney General under federal law. They are controversial, but they remain legally sanctioned under U.S. statutes governing national security inmates. Criticism from human rights organizations. Human rights organizations have repeatedly criticized long-term solitary confinement at ADX. Groups including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have argued that prolonged isolation can constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. They point to international standards such as the United Nations Mandela Rules, which discourage extended solitary confinement beyond 15 consecutive days. The United States, however, operates under domestic constitutional standards. Federal courts have generally upheld the legality of ADX conditions when applied within existing regulations. Judges have consistently ruled that the mere fact of isolation does not automatically violate the Eighth Amendment. However, courts have also emphasized that mental health treatment must be adequate and that conditions must not amount to deliberate indifference to serious medical needs. The legal line is narrow, and it continues to evolve. How many inmates are there? ADX Florence is smaller than many people assume. According to Bureau of Prisons data, the facility typically houses approximately 350 to 400 inmates, though the exact number fluctuates. Compared to large state prisons that house thousands, ADX is relatively compact. Its power lies not in size, but in design. Each inmate occupies a single cell. Staff-to-inmate ratios are higher than in standard facilities. Operational costs per inmate are significantly higher than at traditional federal prisons, though precise per-inmate cost breakdowns are not always publicly itemized. Despite its reputation, ADX represents a small fraction of the federal prison population. Yet its symbolic weight is enormous. It is the endpoint of the federal disciplinary system. The place where inmates are sent when no other facility is deemed secure enough. And for some, it becomes a decades-long reality. Life sentences in permanent isolation. For many inmates at ADX Florence, release is not a realistic outcome. A significant number are serving life sentences in federal prison. Some are serving multiple life terms. Others are serving sentences that extend beyond 100 years. For these individuals, ADX is not a temporary placement. It may be where they will spend the remainder of their lives. Federal sentencing records confirm that several inmates transferred to ADX were already serving life without parole. The Bureau of Prisons does not publicly disclose how many ADX inmates are serving life sentences, but court records confirm that a substantial portion of its population includes individuals convicted of terrorism offenses, large-scale organized crime, espionage, multiple homicide-related federal charges. In such cases, the step-down program may still apply, but release from federal custody itself is not possible. For these inmates, the debate over rehabilitation becomes secondary to the question of humane confinement. Federal courts have consistently held that life imprisonment is constitutional under U.S. law. The conditions under which that life sentence is served, however, continue to be scrutinized. Inmates who left ADX. Not every inmate who enters ADX remains there permanently. Some complete the step-down program. Others are transferred after behavioral improvements or administrative review. There are documented cases of inmates who were moved from ADX to lower security federal institutions. In rare cases, inmates have completed their federal sentences and been released into the community. Publicly available records show that several individuals formerly housed at ADX later transferred to other federal prisons. However, comprehensive public data on post-ADX outcomes is limited. The Bureau of Prisons does not routinely publish longitudinal studies on psychological or social reintegration outcomes for former ADX inmates. Some former prisoners, through legal filings and interviews with journalists, have described the transition from extreme isolation back to general population as deeply challenging. Others have declined public comment. What is clear is that ADX does not operate as an official, no-exit facility. But departure does not necessarily mean recovery. Staff inside the most secure prison. ADX Florence does not function on architecture alone. It operates because of its staff. Correctional officers at ADX undergo specialized training. Working inside a Supermax facility requires strict adherence to procedure. Every inmate movement involves coordination. Every escort is documented. According to Bureau of Prisons employment guidelines, staff are trained in use of force protocols, crisis response, mental health awareness procedures, tactical communication. Violence rates inside ADX are reported to be significantly lower than in many traditional maximum security prisons. The facility's design limits inmate-to-inmate contact, reducing opportunities for assault. However, working in such a controlled environment brings its own challenges. Former staff members interviewed by journalists have described the job as structured, intense, and highly procedural. The Bureau of Prisons does not publicly release detailed internal incident reports except when required through legal proceedings. There have been no successful escape attempts from ADX since it opened in 1994. From a security perspective, the model has achieved its intended outcome. Cost of a Supermax. Operating ADX Florence is expensive. Precise per-inmate cost figures vary depending on calculation method, but government oversight reports indicate that Supermax facilities require significantly higher funding than standard federal prisons. Costs include increased staffing ratios, advanced surveillance systems, infrastructure maintenance, specialized medical and psychological services. While the Bureau of Prisons publishes overall budget figures, detailed breakdowns specific to ADX are not always publicly itemized. Congressional oversight committees have periodically reviewed Supermax spending. Supporters argue the cost is justified given the risk profile of the inmates housed there. Critics argue that long-term isolation may increase healthcare expenses due to mental health deterioration. The financial debate remains ongoing. Legal limits and constitutional boundaries. The Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Over the past 3 decades, federal courts have repeatedly examined whether Supermax confinement crosses that line. In multiple rulings, courts have determined that administrative segregation, including long-term solitary confinement, does not automatically violate the Constitution. However, judges have also ruled that inmates must receive adequate medical and mental health care. Conditions must not demonstrate deliberate indifference. Review procedures for continued placement must exist. The 2016 settlement in Cunningham v. BOP required enhanced mental health protections at ADX. But the core structure of the Supermax model remains intact. As of today, ADX Florence continues to operate under federal authority. Its legality has been tested. Its policies have been modified. But its existence has not been overturned. The symbolism of ADX. ADX Florence holds fewer than 400 inmates. Yet its reputation extends far beyond Colorado. It has become a symbol. To some, it represents control, the ultimate safeguard against individuals deemed too dangerous for ordinary incarceration. To others, it represents the most extreme edge of American punishment. The phrase, buried alive, is not an official description. It is a phrase used by critics and defense attorneys to describe prolonged isolation. The Bureau of Prisons does not use that language. Officially, ADX is described as an administrative maximum facility designed to house inmates requiring the highest level of security. Those two perspectives coexist. One emphasizes safety. The other emphasizes psychological cost. The reality is documented in architecture, policy manuals, court records, and federal budgets. ADX Florence exists. It continues to operate. And it remains the most secure prison in the United States federal system. This is Beyond the Bars. If you found this documentary valuable, support the channel by liking and subscribing. Your support allows us to continue producing deeply researched, fully factual crime and prison documentaries. In our next investigation, we'll step inside another facility where the balance between punishment and security shapes lives behind concrete walls. Until next time.